That's right, I was thinking if you were in your paper,
Okay, so that's already happening. Well, do you have relevant space to this is electronic with here. Whether it's a message for the US, not that. Okay. I'm Michelle. I recognize your picture when they announced your position. I'm a staff member.
okay, nice to meet you. See?
And I was reading about you yesterday.
Oh, all right.
Activism.
No.
Okay, I'm just going
So let's do that here as well. I will basically talk around a bit, more about
so behind doing that kind of work. So not so specific on it, so pick up on whatever you want.
Well, and I was also thinking, because I was reading some other things related to myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then that could be one of many. Respond to your questions
Okay.
together.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then I would bring more kind of
Okay. All
So
right.
actually, there's a book out there that I just did with
Is it on the table?
Yeah. I
Okay.
just put it there. And it has interviews with people in Spain.
All right.
So I'm thinking about
You were in Occupying Greece over here.
in New York. Actually, in New York. I'm now based in New York.
Yeah. Where were you? I was in Greece for 2 months with the Freedom Flotilla when we were trying to get out, 2011. So then we went to the occupation and the protests of Sintagma, more or less every day. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say more as a little bit on the big process, but then more action.
Right. Yeah. All right. Great. Yeah. I'll also give you do some publicity for Division.
Yeah, I saw it looked interesting and looked eclectic when I looked at the different articles
Yeah.
on it, but
But this is attending or increasing the scope of the editorial board and everything. So the Resist Studies magazine is
no, I mean, I didn't mean to
yeah, yes. Monarchy in Sweden, I don't know, is in Berlin.
No, no, just, yeah, you guys this year. Come and check out. This one. That's like how
I love to be here now. I'm going to be here
I love
a gathering.
Oh, really? I feel like that's hard.
And you're staying I'm unfortunately going to New York because I'm here in It is. I love it. I mean, it's going on so much. You know, there was Kurdish demonstration yesterday, and the day before a discussion about race and rebellion. And then there was a protest in solidarity with Kurdistan. And then, I mean, it's going on. So I love it because I mean, in Gothenburg you could be happy that something is happening once a month.
That's funny.
Yeah. I mean, all Sweden is like But and then I found this case here. So that's a nice way to get integrated into everybody. Some people are activists, but in any case, I mean, it's just like like a neighborhood direction. Yeah, I live next door to the village, so it makes sense. I don't like to stay in Yeah. That idea there's something we realize it's kind of obvious, but we realize that when you reach
¿Vas a estar por acá? ¿Vas a estar por acá?
you're worried. We will try to revitalize the network. Can you, making new I want to make we hope that we do the first year, and then when we have something that's we have to see the we would like to make we're all over the
I do have some gratitude.
yeah.
Soft.
Hello, good morning, everyone. If you could begin to take your seats, please, so we can start before we fall behind in the program already. There is somebody over there. There's a program. Yeah, there's a... Oh, no, these two. No, it'll be Barbara's going to introduce Stella and then introduce you. Okay, sure. Could you please take your seats? It's working. Good. Você é Jaime? Oi, Jaime. Prazer, bem-vindo. Conheci mais ou menos pela foto. Você é mais bonita pessoa. No, not me. Thank you. So welcome everyone. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm very excited. I'm Sonia Alvarez. I am here on behalf of both the Center for Latin American, Caribbean and Latino Studies and the Department of Political Science, who are co-organizers of this event. I want to welcome all of you, but most especially our guests who have come from far and near to be with us today. This, as some of you know, is the third research conference sponsored by the Tahrir Moments Research Group, which is a group that was established in 2011 that has focused on studying protests in comparative and transnational perspective. We also organized a two-panel session at the last Latin American Studies Association meetings in Chicago in May of 2014. And actually today's meeting is more centered on the Latin American experience or Latin American experiences, partly because it is largely made possible by a grant from Mellon and the Latin American Studies Association. We're delighted to be having this conference at this particular point in time when, once again, the relevance of protest is ever more clear, from Ferguson to Hong Kong, and we have found no shortage of cases to consider as this project has evolved, and expect that will continue to be so in the future. I won't say anything more than that. I want to get to the substance of our program in a moment, but I just want to thank our sponsors first. This event is supported by the Department of Political Science, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at UMass, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at UMass, the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass, the Gonzalo Long Institute for Latin American Studies at UT Austin, and the Horowitz Endowment, as well as Mellon Lawson. And I want to, as usual, have personal thanks to give to people who are great team players. I want to thank my co-PIs on this project, Barbara and Charlie Hale Barbara Cruikshank from UMass, Charlie Hale from UT Austin, and Michelle Goncalves who runs the show in the Department of Political Science, Gloria Bernabe Ramos and the staff at Clackles, our team of volunteers. You'll see them, and they are around to take care of your every need, but especially the every need of our invited guests. They should have introduced themselves. We have graduate student hosts designated to each of you who are here from off campus. And then most especially, once again, Barbara extended this thanks yesterday, and I will do so very emphatically again. I'd like to thank Marta Balaguer, who most of you have gotten to know intimately via email over the last several months. And Marta, would you stand up and take a bow? Okay, so now I am going to introduce my friend and colleague Barbara, who will introduce our first speakers.
Thank you, Sonia. It is my great pleasure to introduce a new member of the Tahrir Moments Research Group, and almost even better, a new member of the UMass faculty, Stellan Windhagen. And before I do that, I want to extend my appreciation and my admiration for the leadership of Sonia Alvarez. She's the sort of boss who everybody walks away smiling. She is such a delight and a pleasure to work with, and we wouldn't be here without her leadership. So Sonia Alvarez, thanks. So it is a very deep pleasure to welcome Stellan Windhagen not only here today, but to the Tahrir Moments Research Group and to a permanent position here at UMass. He is the inaugural holder of an endowed chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance at the University of Massachusetts. We are thrilled that he is here. He is the author of no fewer than 7 co-authored books, which means he's going to be an awesome collaborator. We've got an amazing collaborator here. We're so excited, and it's so thrilling to see that on his official UMass welcome, I don't know where this was published, but it was distributed widely. One of the things that's noted is that it says, Windhagen has conducted 3 years of field research in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. He served a total of a year in prison for various peace protests involving civil disobedience. And this is the University of Massachusetts bragging about Stellan Vindhagen's prison record. Exactly. Thank you. So we couldn't be happier than to have you here. And I just want to say that Stellan is part of and a co-leader of the Resistance Studies group at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, and he's an academic advisor for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C. So he's very well connected and worldwide scholar of nonviolent resistance. And one of the things that he's planning to do here at UMass, which we're really excited about, is to develop a comprehensive annual report on direct nonviolent actions, similar to reports on violent conflicts and wars. So for the social scientists among us, he's creating a database that's going to be extraordinarily valuable, and we couldn't be more excited than to have your leadership here and to have that be part of the Trier Moments Research Group contribution. So we're so thrilled to have Stellan Vindhagen here, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Barbara. This generous introduction. All right, so I'm going to talk about the topic of, it's a question, is there a need for resistance studies? And I don't know, I hope I will be controversial on some points and provoke some discussion. I work within what you could say the critical theory tradition, critical of domination, yet looking for liberation and progress, hoping that it is possible. And I think that might be provocative for some. I want to take this talk a little bit personal, to tell a little bit about my story, and through that explain why I think there is a need for resistance studies. My parents thought that I would never get a job. I was touring different activist camps, police cells, and I wasn't really very ambitious at university. I had too much other things to do. But as Barbara said, I just got this amazing position as endowed chair and professor of resistance studies, where actually activism in jail was putting me ahead in the short list. I think that's amazing. And it surprised my parents, I can say. So why would then resistance studies be needed? Well, the starting point would of course be that we're living in a world where the structures, the techniques, the resources, and the discourses of domination and repression is expanding all over. And we have seen that happen throughout the history. So that is part of the main problem, which we know too much about. But I would like to add, which might again be, I hope, also giving some thoughts for discussion. My impression is that liberals and radicals are preoccupied with understanding power and the problems within the structure and the system we live. I think we are putting too little emphasis on the possibility for agency within contexts and structures to transform power, dominance, injustices, and repression. The strategies of social change is what I think is the moral obligation of us that are privileged enough to spend a lot of time on understanding the world. There is a pressing need for knowing that among those that are struggling within social movements around in the world. And be assured, if we are looking on it historically, there has never ever in history been so many people mobilized in social movements. particularly in the global south. We are seeing millions of people that are mobilized and trying to affect change. So, what's our contribution to that? Being very much influenced by my family background, where my grandfather was in military prison because he was letting Jews into Sweden during the Second World War, and was a trade union activist, and my father was refusing to go to the military. This upset my grandfather a lot. And both my brother and sister have been working for Mother Teresa in India. I have been growing up with an idea of a moral responsibility for what you're doing. So, at around 15 years old, I was engaged in different social movements, and my particular focus was on the European plowshares movement. I don't know how much you know about the plowshares in the United States, but we are very inspired by them. It's a non-violent direct action movement that is inspired by Gandhi and the Christian thinking of disarming. Well, it's part of some Christian traditions at least. Where people go directly into military bases and military factories using hammers and bolt cutters to actually start a disarmament from below by people destroying equipments for nuclear weapons and weapon production. We tried to start such, you could say, European liberation movement, where we as privileged were taking part in disarming the weapons that are used in domination in the world from the 1980s and onwards. We were able to put off quite a strong mobilization of people from the 80s and onwards up until the end of the 90s, but then it faded out. To our great disappointment. United Kingdom, a more, you could say, legal approach to this form of actions were evolving, which might be surprising with such type of actions, but they were acquitted in the jury trials in UK en masse, actually. It was actually difficult to get sentenced in UK when you were doing these kind of disarmament actions. I succeeded. I ended up in prison. But others, they were then being acquitted. But it didn't really lead to any real change. It led to a discussion in UK about abolishing juries because they were giving these perverse verdicts. And the nuclear weapons are still there. So with these kind of frustrations from my own activist experience, I felt an urgent need to understand more what we could do to improve our ability to affect social change. I had, like perhaps many of you, also a lot of experiences as an activist with ineffectiveness, sectarian tendencies within movements, small-scale mobilization, short-term activist participants coming and going, lack of creativity and innovations. So, despite our trainings and workshops and handbooks, even a research group of lay scholars within that movement, we were not really able to develop. We were still acting in small, temporary, scattered, uncoordinated activism. So I felt that the research was needed. And my key question was, and still is, how it is it possible to create mass disobedience among popular movements? I was interested, and I'm still interested in being of use for activists. So I entered into the PhD studies. I realized that sociology, at least in Sweden then, were afraid of normative and ethical, political oriented research. So it wasn't really a place where I could go. But we have a good tradition of peace studies, so there I could find a place where people were normatively trying to transform violent conflicts and poverty at that department in Gothenburg. But I learned with time that much of that research, also within peace studies, was mostly critical war studies and critical security studies, counting the dead bodies of wars, studying the increased weaponry that is used, but doing little when it came to what we could actually do to affect change. Gandhi was getting more and more irrelevant within peace studies, and I felt like an archaeologist. I was studying Gandhi and was trying to find the relevance of him today. My focus on human liberation struggles was not really present at the department. I went to prison during my PhD studies, and I realized that there was a scope for doing the kind of research that I wanted to do, but that there were few others that I could collaborate with. And to my surprise, I also realized that a number of militant activists, they view my criticism of ineffectiveness of activist movement as a betrayal. And I was thrown out from several anarchist gatherings because they didn't really view me as an activist anymore, since I was talking to the bourgeois press about problems within the movements. In my work, I have found that there is a great gap between structure, agency-oriented research and those that focus more on structure, discourse, and so on. Within nonviolent action studies, which you might never heard of, it's a small field where I try to work. There's very few scholars. They're spread out in the world, and there is a lack of systematic research being done, particularly when it comes to systematic comparative studies. But it's very focused on the strategies and what we could do as activists in a way that is very little informed by critical theories, understandings of intersectionality, or the context where we are struggling. Instead, it comes out as quite universalistic, sorry for my English, advices that more looks like, you know, the 10 points that you can get in a handbook, which is frustrating. But then, with a lot of other theories where I find so much theoretical inspiration, I have been developing more growing frustration from having to look through the index, searching for the few paragraphs and the conclusions or single chapters here and there, dealing with various aspects of different techniques of resistance in different disciplines, and with lack of coherent debate and systematic research. I've been frustrated by finding that a lot of the research within, for example, gender studies is focusing very much on gender domination, but much less on the everyday resistance that is going on in families and patriarchal contexts, trying to find techniques on how to affect change. And the same with a lot of what I found in post-colonial studies. In revolution studies, there is a lot of focus on revolution, of course, but on structures, history, and the armed struggles, and much less when it comes to what actually popular movements could do, particularly with unarmed means. I found the everyday resistance work by James Scott and others very inspiring, with its focus on peasants and subaltern studies. But there was very little when it came to the outcomes, how small individual acts transform into mass rebellions, how that actually create a change. So I found very much of my home in social movement studies. But also there, at least my impression is, to continue this rant or criticism of the fields, I find that there has been some kind of an academic development of professionalization and specialization that has left a lot of the key questions that are concerning activists far behind. And I have, like many of you, struggle with the conceptual differences that exist between all the kind of concepts we're using, where there is perhaps little of coherent debate around the differences between, for example, protests, resistance, movements, revolutions. I found it very interesting when the book Contentious Politics came, 2001, with some of the founders of social movement studies and revolution studies, Charles Tilly, Doug McAdams, Sidney Taro. They were trying to look on all of this together in a unity theory, movements, revolutions, and rebellions, and civil war, but with a very strong structural focus, not so much to say in terms of strategies for activists, and with a focus on contentious politics, there was very little on the everyday, the hidden, disguised forms of resistance. So I came to the conclusion that there is a need for resistance studies. There is a need for collecting the different concepts and approaches that are trying to understand resistance. So in Gothenburg from 2005 and onwards, we were working on developing resistance studies. I did my PhD on nonviolent resistance. I was looking on Gandhi from the view of Foucault and classical sociology, and trying to see how it was possible to understand this religiously fanatic, half-naked fakir that Churchill called him. If he's still relevant today. My conclusion was that he was probably insane in many ways, but also a genius when it came to strategies for activists. My colleague Mona Lilia, she did her PhD on everyday resistance among Cambodian women within male-dominated politics. And we collaborated, and do still, from then on. We tried to develop resistance studies with a numerous number of articles, conceptually with a theoretical framework dealing with everyday resistance, law and resistance, Foucault and resistance. And the paper I have submitted for this conference is on Foucault and resistance. I don't know if people have got access to it, but if you want, I can send it to you. From 2011, to our surprise, after several years with a zero budget, and applause from the department that thought that this was very theoretically innovative and interesting, but a suicide in terms of academics, because it was too normative, too political. In 2011, to our surprise, we got substantial research grants from the Swedish Research Council, looking on how resistance plays a role for democratization and globalization in the Middle East and in South Asia. And then we are seeing this possibility with the endowed share that I've got now as a possibility to create links academically between Amherst and Gothenburg. That's my hope, that could develop. And in that track, we are launching right now a new journal of resistance studies, where the editorial board is really already on the making. And I have with me the policy statement for you to take if you're interested, which I will put over there. So, then you might ask yourself, what is then this with resistance studies? What is it all about? Well, I would suggest it is very much an interdisciplinary focus on all forms of resistance that links sub-themes within other disciplines, mainly within studies on social movement, revolution, gender, queer, race, class, post-colonialism, and subaltern studies. With a focus on the potential and the problems for human liberation. And with a suggested definition that is very tentative, open for debate of course, that would capture resistance as being everything where we have a subaltern action that might undermine power. A subaltern action that might undermine power. That is 4 key ingredients in that definition. There is always a relation of power or dominance. You cannot talk about resistance without establishing firstly that there exists a relation of power and dominance, I think. And then you have to identify the subaltern position within that relation. And you look on the practice or the technique that people are doing that might be hidden, disguised, that might be small scale, that might be mass scale, that might be violent or might be peaceful or whatever. And fourthly, with a potential to undermine, weaken, or destabilize power, at least temporary. So a lot of debates arise from this definition and within resistance studies as it exists so far. Do you need an intention to undermine? James Scott would suggest that you need a class antagonism. If you don't have that, you don't have resistance. I would dispute that. I think one of the most powerful resistance movements going on right now is the file sharing movement. The people that are sharing programs, music, movies, whatever. I would propose, without having empirical evidence, that about 1 to 2% of them would be politically motivated. The rest, they're doing it because they love music, programs, or whatever for free. But if you look on the outcomes, it's undermining an industry that is a multi-billion industry that is getting money from their copyrights on intellectual property. So it is, in my terms, resistance. Another debate is around, does resistance have to be public? Well, I don't think it's only public. And if we want to understand the public forms, the sudden rebellions that are happening, we need to study the hidden and disguised forms, because there are links. I think we can't understand the sudden rebellions in Burma in 1988 and 2007 if you don't look on what happened before in 88 and 2007. There were ongoing resistance that were hidden because of the repression. It had to be. I think there are a lot of resistance going on that is about working slow and working bad. When people feel exploited, that they are then doing their resistance in a creative way. We academics, it doesn't work like that. We work like maniacs. Another debate is around if it's only about collective action. I don't think so. I think it can be individual as well. As when people are badly paid, they borrow things at their workplace that they bring home. And the employer will call that stealing. A fourth debate is around the political power effect, if that is necessary. I think it's enough if there is a potential of an effect. It doesn't have to be successful. It's too much to ask of resistance that it has to be successful. I think even the slave that is spitting in the soup before serving the master is doing resistance. A fifth debate is around if resistance is dealing with all kinds of domination and power, or only the kind of domination and power that we don't like. I think resistance is also about fascist resistance. It's also about how children are making resistance against their parents. It's also about types of resistance we don't like, perhaps. And then there is a debate around the role of violence and armed resistance. So there's a lot of debates here. I think that is fine, that's great. I'm not suggesting something of that we should have a unity in such as resistance studies. Instead, we should have plurality. They should be heterodox. It should be a lot of different traditions and concepts. So the definition I propose is just a starting point for a debate. But of course, as you have realized, your favorite definition of power will decide a lot. what is then resistance. If we work with Luke's 3 dimensions, it will matter a lot if you're using a first or second or third dimensional power. And if you add intersectionality to it, then you have a lot of power relations that is working similarly at the same time in any context. As will be clear from the article I have here at the conference on Foucault, the forms of resistance will differ depending on if we're talking about the sovereign power or if we're talking about the productive power of Foucault. We have different discipline systems or even different forms of biopower, as for example with the neoliberal regimes that we're living under today. That will, of course, influence what type of resistance that becomes interesting and relevant. What would be possible if we develop such a resistance studies? Well, I think we would have more of theoretical development, contextual understandings, and dynamics where we would understand the dynamics between power and resistance. And we would have a possibility of more systematic, both quantitative and qualitative comparisons between resistance. And here comes maybe, which might provoke some people, I think we could develop something similar to medicine or military research, but with a very different focus. Empirically driven and contextually adopted technique development for human liberation, where we could learn what kind of techniques are working in what kind of contexts, where we could actually have something to say when activists are asking us, what should we do today when ISIS is threatening the Kurdish people? What should we do in Syria today? And I think we should have an answer. We should have something to say. And we should have something else to say than what Obama is saying, to invade yet another country and bomb and try to create democracy from 5,000 meters and bombing people into, I don't know what, respect of liberal values. But we have to avoid not just being problem solving within existing discourses and within the political, economic, and cultural system relations that we find ourselves. We have to be both problem solving and system critical thinking. So I propose a number of research questions that could guide these kind of resistance studies, 5 of them. Firstly, what circumstances make the negotiation of power possible? Secondly, how may power be negotiated? Using which means, strategies, and practices? Thirdly, in what situations or circumstances do the negotiations of the resistance have any impact, and what kind of impact? Fourthly, when do movements and actions of resistance in itself contribute to new relations of power? Fifthly, what is the relationship between power, social change, and resistance? If this is going to be possible, we have to create the conditions for it. And I think we need to collaborate across a lot of disciplines. We have to look on different academic traditions, focusing on understanding variations of how agency, social change, and domination could be linked. But we also need to do a second thing, which is controversial in Sweden, which I'm realizing is not as controversial here, and that is collaborations between academics and the practitioners, the activists. We have to establish that. There's a lot of reflection going on among activists. There's a lot of experience, systematic build-up among activists where the innovations are happening, where we need to collaborate. And we need to create journals, meeting spaces, joint publications, conferences, and research projects in collaborations between these academics and these activists. And then I think we are on way doing something. Lastly, what are the challenges that we're facing here then, if we would create resistance studies? We have a very specific area, but a very broad area with many disciplines and a few specialized researchers. That's a challenge in itself. But I think there is also the challenge of trying to avoid master frames or paradigms that serve certain power interests, as we can learn from medicine and military research, how they have served those with the power and the money. We need to study both the possibilities and the problems of all kinds of resistance, which means that we as resistance researchers will not always be popular among activists. We will sometimes point out the weaknesses, the ineffectiveness, the sectarian tendencies, the production of new power. So, lastly, I want to say that the challenge is how to study without serving the repressive forces and the domination, and instead contribute to increased human liberation in solidarity with the subalterns. Thank you.
Thank you, Stellan. Marina Citrine is going to offer some comments on Stellan's talk, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, so I don't know if this is working. If I do it from here, we're not recording, it's fine. Can everybody hear me though? Is that? No, turn on. Okay, so all of my little things here. Sorry. I'm only responding for say 5 or 7 minutes. And just to say that I have been working, I mean, this was great and so thought-provoking, and now I have so many notes, so what to respond to. But what I've been working on are the new global movements post-2010, looking particularly at Greece and Spain, Portugal, Brazil, some of the common forms of organization, the horizontal forms, the directly democratic forms, and alternative forms of power, and then also Latin America over the last 20 years. So kind of seeing that as part of a very similar continuum of new forms of organization. So that's going to be my comments are kind of grounded in that. And starting with the intentionality, I think that's really important in this. Do you need the intentionality to undermine? I really like that, and maybe we can talk about that more over the next 2 days, because particularly in the newer movements, I think that's really true, that so many people who are organizing, you know, whether the slogan is real democracy, but it's coming from the they don't represent us. It's not let's organize a new democratic or directly democratic movement, but rather we're not being represented, we have to look to one another. So there's not the same intentionality of let's construct alternative democracy, at least in the beginning. And I think that's also true with the question of power in the movements, where, again, say in Greece, having had 5 general strikes and being completely ignored, you know, protesting against austerity, or the movements in Spain and in Portugal and all over the world. In Brazil, I'm looking, as we have friends here from Brazil, with the movements around free fare and saying, you know, we protest this, we're against this, and being completely ignored. So feeling, you know, we're talking about millions of people around the world feeling that the state has really turned their back on them. And so people then turn to one another to figure out what to do and create alternatives. So there isn't that intentionality, and that links to, and I share your critique of the contentious politics framework. And if that's something we can delve into as well a little bit in the next 2 days, because it necessitates a relationship, not just a relationship, it necessitates that your point of reference is institutions of power, whether that's the state or banks. And the new movements are not looking to those institutions to make change. Again, not necessarily ideologically. It's not because they are against the state or against the bank, or at least not at first. But because those institutions aren't solving their needs. So people are looking to one another, and examples range from, you know, the massive housing movement that I think people know about that's all over the world, the Plataforma in Spain that has 260 groups, you know, people who are affected by the mortgage crisis, part of what sparked the economic crisis, 2008. And neighbors who look to one another and form assemblies and then defend one another and defend the house. So it's not let's go protest and ask to not be evicted, it's we are together going to keep people housed. And that is seen again and again. I mean, that's throughout the world now. In the US, people may or may not know how much that's taking place in Minnesota and Chicago. People have been taking over abandoned homes and moving in homeless families. So again, that point of reference is actually one another to make that change. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about contentious politics. It's what are we contending and to whom and where are we looking? Which then problematizes the language of protest and maybe resistance. This is something I'd like to engage more, because resistance so often feels like, okay, we're resisting X, rather than we're creating this, and we don't want you to get in our way, you being whatever institution of power that is. So how do we, without changing all of the language that's existed, how do we explain what's been taking place? There's so many examples I would love to go into as far as those people looking to one another. One little one, they're all over the world around electricity and housing, healthcare. But in Detroit, I don't know if people know, I'm kind of bringing it to a US, they've cut off, there's 300,000 people listed to have their water shut off for non-payment. We're talking $125. That started in August. And there was a traditional movement that would have fit the Tilly, Thoreau, McAdam, protest movement definitions. But then what also has come up, and I think inspired by or kind of coming out of the DNA of the Occupy movements, is people who are refusing to let the water be shut off. So they're rigging tanks, they're chasing water trucks out of neighborhoods when they come in. It's that we're going to do it ourselves and with one another, and that's that